Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to go through part of the 2020 New South Wales HSC Business Studies exam. We're going to focus on the short answers for this video, and we're going to look at two in particular. If you want to go through the multis, I've got a separate video that you can get to up there, or by linking in the description. So in terms of this video, we're going to look at questions 21 and 22. So 21 is HR and question 22 is marketing. Now, to be clear, I'm not giving model responses here because there are so many different ways to answer questions like this. What I'm trying to do is give a model process, the kind of process that you could apply to any question that you would get along the way. What I'll also do is have another video that I'll link to in the description when it's ready that will go through questions 23 and 24. Okay, so let's get stuck into question 21 of the 2020 New South Wales Business Studies HSC exam. Also, there will be time codes in the description if you want to jump around to different parts of each question. So here we are, question 21. When I'm looking down at this, I can see external stakeholder, I see like workplace, I can see voluntary, involuntary separation. That is telling me that this question relates to HR. So that's very helpful because I can focus my attention and efforts just on that key business function. First question here says outline, okay, the role of one external stakeholder. Okay, so with external stakeholder, I might just put down, okay, so that is who represents the interests of employees in workplace disputes. Okay, well, so that's telling me that they want us to talk here about unions because they are the ones that would be representing employees. So if we're looking at the role of unions, unions represent the interests of their members in terms of pay and conditions in the workplace. And that in the situation of a workplace dispute, their role here is going to be with the bosses, right? It's their role to work with the employers to try and find a solution to the dispute. So what we could say here is that if we are talking about unions and we're thinking about this here, advocating for their members, they are representing their interests in terms of negotiate with employers, so that if we take this a little bit further, that we could say negotiate with employers, find that resolution to the disputes, because the employer isn't going to negotiate with every single individual employee. That what they're going to want to do is to get everyone together to try and find a solution. Let's move to here to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary separation. So if we're thinking about this particular point here, is that I would very specifically say, okay, so voluntary, and then I'll go on to explain that involuntary separation is. So that I would set it up as like almost two separate answers in the context of this question. And that if I've got 4 marks on offer, I'm thinking, okay, well, that section is worth 2 and that section is worth 2. If there are 2 marks on offer, that the way I'm breaking it down in my mind is that one would be for the definition, what is this thing? And then the other would be for an example to demonstrate my knowledge. So that if I'm starting with the first part, voluntary separation, that the key part here is that the employee chooses to leave. So the employee makes a decision that, yes, it's time to leave this business. So for example, in terms of demonstrating this, you could talk about, okay, well, someone decides to retire. Maybe someone decides to resign from their job because they are moving to a different opportunity or they just don't want to work there anymore. The other thing you could think about is that maybe an employee is moving, whether interstate or different city or even a different country, and that will no longer work at that workplace. Okay, if we then go to the next part here, the employee is forced to leave, that this outcome is being imposed on them. So that if we think about the kinds of situations where an employee would be forced to leave, someone has been made redundant, that their position is no longer required. The other thing you could think about is that maybe the employee well, that their employment, not the employee themselves, but their employment has been terminated, right? That they've essentially been fired. That here we can think about that what maybe they've committed a sackable offense. And so that way that the company is saying it's time for you to move on, it's not your choice. And these are the reasons why. Our last part of question 21 is about technology and globalization. So that the question says, we'll just change it up in the color. So explain, fine, how technological influences, and I would really push that, right? Make sure that I understand that the answer has to contain both, and globalization can lead to a company reducing staff numbers. Okay, so I'm starting to see the focus of this question. If I set it up, and again, this is not a model answer, this is just how I would approach it, that here we can see 4 marks on offer. Okay, 2 things, technology and globalization. So again, this seems to me like a 2 by 2. So that one part would be the how, and then the other part would be the example, because the question has specifically asked for relevant examples. So if you don't provide those examples, you can't access those higher marks. So let's think about it here. So we've got our first thing that we would set up is that how does technology lead to less staff? That's really the relationship that the question is looking at. And then if I go to the other part, it's following the same pattern. How does globalization, and when we're talking about less staff, so when we're talking about less staff here, let's put this in the same color, less staff here, we are saying that in less staff in the domestic operations. That's probably more relevant in terms of the globalization, but that will become clear. So if I think about how can technology lead to less staff, right, the how part first, well, then I would think here about replacing labor with capital. And that when I'm talking about capital here, I'm talking about machines, I'm talking about robots, anything that is taking the place of those workers in the company. For example, if I'm then thinking about what would my example be, at our school we do Qantas as our case study, so I might think, oh, okay, yeah, with Qantas, that they've got the e-check-ins. So you don't have to go to that person and check in, that you can do it electronically before you get into the actual airport, right? And the e-check-in is replacing those people with terminals. So we're saying that we have people, and that what happened is that we eliminate the roles for people and we replace them with the terminals, right? So that we are then reducing our staff numbers. Another one I thought about, depending on what examples that you're looking at, is you might also talk about an online business that it closes its retail outlets. So then you would say, oh, okay, so then there would be less people working in those stores because they no longer need them. They're selling it through online channels. When I think about globalization and reducing staff numbers, that I really think about outsourcing. So that the idea here would be that if a company outsources a key business function, that it can access cheaper labor overseas, using that instead of local or domestic labor, and that this option here, that local or domestic, that they command higher wages. So if I'm looking at 2 by 2, so how would it happen? Well, a company would source key business function or elements of a key business function from an outsourcing provider overseas that would then provide cheaper labor. So if we are talking about our example with Qantas, just move this over slightly here. So if I'm thinking about this point in terms of my example, so I've got Qantas, that Qantas outsourced cleaning staff, and baggage handlers, so that is how it was reducing the staff that it required in terms of those functions, by using globalization, the influence of globalization. So a couple of things before we get into answering the question itself. Let's look at the stimulus here. So it says a popular Australian guitar manufacturer. So the key part here, I think, is, well, it's not, I'm sort of rubbing off the rest of the questions, aren't I? So let's make that a little bit smaller. So that the thing I'd like to remind you or tell you for the first time, depending on how many times you've been here, is that every question in a stimulus like this is super deliberate. So if it says something like popular, that is going to feed into the question in some way. So that it's an Australian guitar manufacturer and it's about to enter the US market using a standardized marketing strategy. Part A says, clarify, what an interesting directive term, the purpose, so the reason for doing a SWOT analysis for this business. Now, again, the wording super deliberate, that it is for this business. It is not in general. It is talking about this business in particular. So if I'm thinking about the kind of things that I would include, again, this is not a perfect answer. So if I'm thinking about this idea of purpose, that what I'm kind of thinking about, well, that we've got our strengths and weaknesses on one side and our opportunities and threats. So what are the internal factors that the business is good at? So that would be our strength, or needs to improve, and that would be our weakness. So that is very helpful in terms of telling us that what is the current situation of the business. If we think about the opportunities and threats, and particularly in the context of this business, we're thinking about what are the external opportunities and challenges in going to the US, the issues with expansion. And the issues maybe isn't the best word, but we're looking at kind of like the positives and the negatives with expansion. And so while that was the current situation, that this is very much looking at the future. So that if I'm looking at this question, that yes, I've got the purpose in a way, but then I'm sort of thinking it will clarify the purpose. So this is what it does. And then what does it allow the business to do? So I think, okay, well, SWOT analysis is part of situational analysis. So once a business has done the situational analysis, it can then set the rest of the marketing process, right? So for example, it can use that and then set the marketing objectives. So it really kickstarts the marketing process, or underpins, because it's really the basis for a lot of the things that the company might choose to do. It's 3 marks, right? It's not like 1 mark or even 2 marks. So that what I might be doing is thinking about how would I allocate those numbers. So let's just say, for example, that would be red, that I might think, okay, well, one of the purposes is the internal things at the moment. Another purposes would be the external things that are happening. And then this is what it would allow the business to do. It says here, recommend a pricing strategy or pricing method, recommend a pricing method that this business could adopt for the US market. Interesting language, right? It's actually telling us, please recommend a pricing method, and that it is for the US market, not domestically, right? So it's for the market that it is moving into. The business is unfamiliar with the US market, right? It's very experienced and popular Australian brand, but has not been in the US market. So it's not sure about how the pricing actually works, right? So in order to understand that, yes, the business could do market research, find out a range of prices that customers were prepared to pay, and then charge something there. It's complicated and costly, potentially. So what it could actually do in terms of trying to get into the market and get operating is that this business, this guitar manufacturer, could use competitor pricing. And that with competitor pricing, that what we do is we use the competitor's price as a basis, and then we adjust our price based on that. So for example, if we use competitor pricing, then there is no need for this market research. So we might save time and money there. In terms of the competitors' pricing, are we going below that price? Are we going to go equal to that price? Or are we going to go above that price? That will undercut the price of the competitors. And what I'm trying to do is to rapidly gain market share. If I am charging equal to the price, then I'm saying, well, the product is as good as the competition. And what we will do is we will differentiate on other factors. So not price, other factors. Or we could charge above the competitor's price and we could say, well, we've got this superior product and we want to establish our position as a premium brand in the marketplace. So that you could say, okay, we recommend that the business uses competitive pricing because there's no need for market research. We can just base the price on where we want to position ourselves in relation to the competition and then set out the options. And that's how we would go about doing that. Okay, so let's go to our third part for this question. So the question here says, justify this business's decision to adopt a standardized marketing strategy. So again, a pretty interesting directive term here, justify, so that we're trying to provide a basis for this decision. What I find interesting is it's not asking us to discuss. If we were going to discuss, then they would be like, hey, tell us the pros and the cons. But we're not being told to discuss. We're told justify. Justify means just tell us the good points. Just tell us the positives about this. I think this is quite an interesting perspective for the question to take. Anyway, that's just what they've done. So that if I'm thinking about this question, is that to me, this is a bit unusual because usually if the business is going to go into a new market, particularly an overseas market, then we might think you're going to need to create a customized approach, one that is particularly targeted to that market. But what this question is telling us is justify why it would take a standardized approach so that it would not customize its offering, but would use the existing marketing approaches. In terms of the syllabus, hang on one sec. In terms of the syllabus here, that obviously we're talking about marketing, that what we are talking about here is we're talking about marketing strategies and that this is part of global marketing. Global marketing there looks at that issue of standardization versus customization. So that's where it would sit. So, okay, I'm thinking I have to provide the pros for a standardized marketing strategy. So I would think about, again, another sort of 2x2 approach where I've got one thing where I've got the definition and an example, and then another thing as well. I think that the overwhelming idea in terms of why you would adopt a standardized thing is that it is cheaper, because what you are really doing is you are taking an existing marketing strategy and you are just duplicating it. So you will save dollars because you are using maybe some minor changes, but not major things, so that there is no need to customize it to create something from scratch. So when we're talking about cheaper, we are not creating it from scratch. So that would be one. So, and you would say that this guitar manufacturer can just use its existing strategy in the new market. Then I'm sort of thinking, okay, what else could I include here? What else would be useful? Something that you could think about is that part of the stimulus was that this was a popular guitar brand, right? That it was specifically mentioned in the stimulus, and here is where it becomes relevant. So that what we could say is if we use the standardized approach, then maybe there is less risk for the business because the manufacturer is expanding an already popular brand. So that if we think about it for customers, so US customers, that they will recognize the brand because it's a popular one. And then it would be a less risky purchase. And that could help to increase sales as part of that expansion strategy. So those would be two things that I would include. You may have different ideas, and please put them in the comments if you do. So that was my discussion of these two questions. As I mentioned, that this is all about process, not about model responses. So I'm really looking to model how I would go about answering the question, not the exact words that I would use. Hopefully this was helpful. If there's anything that you are unsure of, just put that in the comments. I'll also have a link to the 23 and 24 questions. When that's all done, that'll be in the description. And as always, thank you very much for watching.